There is a name on my grandmother's will that I have never heard before in my life. Not a distant cousin, not an old church friend, not someone from her neighborhood in Beaumont, Texas, who used to bring her sweet potato pie on Sundays. A stranger, a legal stranger, someone who walked into the last chapter of my grandmother's life and embedded herself so completely, so quietly, that by the time the rest of us even understood what was happening, the paperwork was already done. $1.7 million. That is what my grandmother's estate was worth. The house on Calder Avenue that she had owned since 1974. The savings accounts she had, built penny by penny for 50 years. The mineral rights on a small piece of land out in Hardin County that none of us even knew had value until an oil company came knocking. And almost all of it, almost every dollar of it, was about to walk out the door with someone we did not know. Except for one thing. One quiet, stubborn, beautiful thing my grandmother had done years before any of this started. Before the stranger arrived. Before the manipulation. Before the rewriting of a family's entire financial future. She had already moved the house into a trust. And that single decision, made on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a law office on College Street, is the reason I am sitting here today with anything left to tell you about at all. My name is Nicole. And this is the story of how my grandmother's estate almost disappeared, and what we did to stop it. Let me tell you about Dorothy Mae Calloway. Because if you are going to understand how any of this happened, you need to understand who she actually was. Not the version that gets written in an obituary. The real one. My grandmother was born in 1941, in a 2-room house in Vidor, Texas. She was the youngest of 6 children. Her father worked for the railroad. Her mother took in laundry. They were not poor in the way that people romanticize. There was nothing quaint about it. There were winters where the 4 youngest children shared one coat between them and took turns going outside. She used to tell me that story without any bitterness, just facts. She would say, "Nicole, cold is just cold. You either get through it, or you do not." She got through everything. She married my grandfather, James Calloway, in 1963. He was a machinist at the Texaco refinery. They were not wealthy people. They were working people, the kind who kept envelopes of cash in a kitchen drawer and paid every bill in person at the counter, because they did not fully trust banks for the first 20 years of their lives. But they were smart, patient. They saved in a way that most people their generation did not bother to. They bought that house on Calder Avenue in Beaumont in 1974 for $42,000. My grandfather died in 2001, and my grandmother kept that house. She paid off every last cent of it. She fixed the roof herself twice, or rather, she stood in the yard and directed the 2 men she had hired, because she knew exactly what needed to happen and she was not going to pay for something done wrong. By 2019, that house was worth nearly $800,000. The Beaumont real estate market had not exactly turned into Austin, but it had moved. And my grandmother, without ever setting foot in a financial planning office in her life, had accidentally become a wealthy woman. There were also the savings accounts. She had 4 of them, spread across 3 different banks. I learned this later, during the audit. One at Regions, one at Wells Fargo, one at a local credit union where she had been a member since 1978. Combined, they held somewhere just under $600,000. Built over decades. Never invested aggressively. Never gambled on anything. Just deposited, month after month, because Dorothy Mae Calloway believed that money you could see was money you could count on. And then there were the mineral rights. That was the surprise. A small parcel of land out in Hardin County that her grandfather had left her father, who had left it to her, and which had sat in the family deed records doing nothing for 40 years, until an energy company came looking in 2018 and offered a lease. Suddenly, there was another $300,000 and some attached to Dorothy Mae's name. She was 80 years old when she signed that lease. She told me she almost did not answer the door when the landman knocked. She used some of that money to fix the front porch. She put the rest in a CD. That was Dorothy. Now here's the part that matters for this story. My grandmother had 4 children. My mother, Renee, is the oldest. Then there is my Uncle Gerald, who lives in Houston. Aunt Patricia in Lufkin. And my Uncle Marcus, the youngest, who lived the closest to Dorothy, about 20 minutes away in Port Arthur. For most of my grandmother's life, this was a functional family. Not perfect, There were arguments at Thanksgiving. There was an old disagreement between Gerald and Marcus about a car that went unresolved for 4 years. But nothing that rose to anything serious. Nothing that made you think this family would one day end up with lawyers and private investigators and a restraining order. That was before the caregiver arrived. My grandmother had her first health scare in the spring of 2020. A fall in the kitchen. Nothing broken, thank God. But it scared her enough that she agreed to let us hire someone to come in 3 days a week. Just to help with the house, with cooking, with driving her to her doctor appointments. We found her through a local agency. Her name was Brenda Holt. She was 4 years old, originally from Nacogdoches. She had a portfolio of references. Good ones. She had worked with elderly clients before. She presented herself as warm, efficient, and professional. The agency had done a background check. Everything came back clean. My mother and my Aunt Patricia interviewed her together in my grandmother's living room. They liked her. My grandmother liked her. She was easy to talk to, good at listening, and she always showed up exactly on time. I met Brenda 3 weeks after she started. My mother had asked me to stop by while I was in Beaumont visiting. I remember thinking she seemed fine. Competent. She had reorganized my grandmother's pantry in a way that actually made sense, and my grandmother looked better, more rested, than she had in months. The thing I remember most is how she spoke to my grandmother. Not the way a lot of caregivers do. That slightly louder, slightly slower voice that is respectful but also a little condescending. Brenda talked to Dorothy like she was talking to an equal. Like she genuinely found her interesting. And my grandmother, who had been a little lonely since the pandemic began, who had not been able to have her friends over, who had not been able to go to her church in months, my grandmother bloomed under that attention. I should have paid more attention to that. Not because kindness is suspicious, but because loneliness is a door, and the right person, with the right key, can walk through it without you ever hearing the lock turn. If this kind of situation feels familiar to you, if you have watched someone you love become the center of another person's world a little too quickly, stay with me. Because this story is going to go somewhere I did not expect. And I think a lot of families have been here without ever realizing it until it is almost too late. 3 days a week became 5 days a week by the end of 2020. The agency increased Brenda's hours at my grandmother's request. My mother thought it was a good idea. Dorothy's mobility had gotten worse, and the pandemic meant that none of us could visit as freely as we wanted to. By the spring of 2021, Brenda was there 6 days a week. She had a key to the house. She was picking up my grandmother's prescriptions, managing her grocery lists, driving her to medical appointments, and handling most of the logistical communication with my grandmother's doctors. Again, none of that is inherently wrong. That is what a caregiver does. But here is what we did not notice at the time. Or rather, here is what I did not notice. Because I was living 3 hours away in Dallas, working a job that consumed 60 hours of my week, and telling myself that my grandmother was in good hands. I should have called more. I know that now. Not because a phone call would have stopped what was coming. I am not sure anything would have. But I would have heard the changes sooner. I would have noticed the shift in how Dorothy talked about her own family. Because it started subtle. The way it always does. My mother noticed it first, in a phone call with Dorothy sometime around March of 2021. My grandmother made an offhand comment about how Gerald never came to see her. My mother pointed out that Gerald had visited just 6 weeks before. Dorothy said she did not remember it that way. My mother let it go, because memory lapses in an 81-year-old are not unusual. You do not want to start an argument over something that might just be forgetfulness. Then, Aunt Patricia called me in April. She said that Dorothy had told her that none of the grandchildren ever checked in, that she felt forgotten by the family. Patricia was confused. She had sent flowers for Dorothy's birthday, called her every Sunday, and driven up for Easter. She asked me if something had changed with Grandma's memory. I called my grandmother that same week. And she was fine. She was warm, she was funny. She asked me about my job and my apartment and whether I was eating enough. Nothing alarming. I got off the phone thinking Patricia had misunderstood something. But the calls kept coming. Small things. Gerald saying Dorothy had mentioned to him that she was redoing her will. But when he asked her about it, she said she did not know what he was talking about. My mother saying that Dorothy had started talking about Brenda the way she used to talk about her own children, Brenda is so good to me, Nicole. She is the only one who really understands what I need. That phrase, I remember writing it down in a text to my mother. The only one. That is not how my grandmother talked. Dorothy Mae Calloway was a woman who reserved the deepest praise for people she had known for decades. She was not effusive. She did not hand out only ones lightly. But I still did not get in my car and drive to Beaumont. I called my Uncle Marcus, who lived the closest. He said Grandma seemed fine to him. He said Brenda seemed nice. He said maybe we were overthinking it. So I waited. And while I waited, something was being built around my grandmother. Layer by layer, quiet and careful, and completely invisible to anyone who was not standing inside that house watching it happen in real time. What I did not know yet was that Brenda Holt had already begun accompanying my grandmother to meetings with her estate attorney, and she had already, on at least 2 documented occasions, waited in the room. It was a Tuesday in August of 2021. I remember that specifically because I had just gotten off a conference call that had run 40 minutes over, and I was eating a sad desk lunch of cold leftover pasta when my phone rang. It was my Uncle Gerald. He did not say hello. He just said, "Nicole, I need you to look something up for me." The Jefferson County Appraisal District website. Look up Grandma's house. I put down the pasta. Gerald is not a dramatic person. He is an accountant. He speaks in complete sentences, and he does not call people to look things up, unless the looking up is going to confirm something that has already made him go very still and very quiet. That tone in his voice, measured, careful, like he was containing something, I recognized it. I had heard it once before, when he called to tell me our grandfather had died. I pulled up the Jefferson County Appraisal District website on my laptop. I typed in the address on Calder Avenue. The ownership record had been updated. The house was no longer listed under Dorothy Mae Calloway. It was listed under the Calloway Family Living Trust, which, on its surface, sounds exactly right. My grandmother had in fact set up a trust. That trust was real. My grandmother's attorney, a man named Robert Thibodeau, who had handled her affairs for 20 years out of an office on Caribe Street, had helped her establish it in 2018 as part of basic estate planning. The house had been transferred into that trust. That was legitimate. That was intentional. That was the decision that would later save us. But Gerald had found something else. A second document. Filed with the county clerk's office 4 months earlier. An amendment to the trust. An amendment that added a co-trustee. Brenda Holt. Brenda Holt, who had been in my grandmother's employ for 14 months at that point, had been named as a co-trustee of the Calloway Family Living Trust, which meant she had legal authority over the management of the trust's assets, which meant that, depending on how the amendment was worded, she might have signature authority over accounts connected to that trust. I sat at my desk in Dallas, and I looked at my cold pasta, and I listened to Gerald breathe on the other end of the phone. And neither of us said anything for a long moment. Then Gerald said, "There is more." Of course there was more. The amendment had not been filed by Robert Thibodeau. It had been filed by a different attorney. One none of us had ever heard of. One whose office, when I looked it up 20 minutes later, was located not in Beaumont, but in Orange, Texas. 30 miles away. Here is what I want you to understand about the next 3 weeks, because it is the part of this story I am least proud of. I called my grandmother, and she told me everything was fine. She said she had made the change herself, that she had decided she wanted Brenda involved in the trust, because Brenda was the one who was actually there, who actually helped her. She said, and I can hear her voice saying this, clear as anything, "Nicole, I am 81 years old, and I know what I am doing." And I backed down. Because, what do you say to that? She was not wrong that she was 81 and legally competent. She was not wrong that she had the right to amend her own trust. And I did not want to be the granddaughter who flew down to Beaumont to tell an elderly woman she could not make her own decisions. I did not want to be that person. I told myself I was respecting her autonomy. What I was actually doing was choosing comfort over clarity. I told my mother what Dorothy had said. My mother, who wanted to believe it too, accepted it. Gerald was less convinced, but he did not push. Aunt Patricia said we should monitor the situation. Uncle Marcus said Grandma was sharp and we needed to trust her judgment, so we monitored. which mostly meant we called more often and paid closer attention to what Dorothy said. And for about 6 weeks, nothing alarming happened. Dorothy seemed good. She mentioned Brenda less. We started to exhale. Then my mother drove up to Beaumont for a long weekend in October. She arrived on a Friday afternoon. Brenda was there. What my mother noticed, and what she called me about that same evening from the driveway of my grandmother's house, speaking quietly so she would not be heard, was this. There was a folder on Dorothy's kitchen table. A legal folder, the kind with the string closure. My mother had seen it when she walked in. When she came back from the bathroom 10 minutes later, the folder was gone, and Brenda was in the kitchen. My mother asked Dorothy what the folder was. Dorothy said she did not know what folder my mother was talking about. My mother described it specifically. Manila. Legal size. The string. Dorothy shook her head and said she did not remember any folder. Brenda, from the kitchen, called out that she thought maybe it was some old insurance paperwork that had already been dealt with. My mother came home 2 days later and did not sleep well for a week. She called me and said, "Nicole, something is wrong. I do not know what it is exactly, but something is wrong." I had heard variations of that sentence 3 or 4 times over the past year. Each time, nothing had turned out to be immediately provable. Each time, my grandmother had given a reasonable-sounding explanation, and we had stood down. I was tired of feeling suspicious of a situation I could not quite see clearly. I was tired of the emotional cycle, alarm, investigation, reassurance, back to baseline. But something about the folder bothered me differently. Not its disappearance. Folders get moved. But the explanation. Brenda answering for Dorothy from another room before Dorothy had even finished processing the question. That is not what an employee does. That is what a handler does. I want to ask you something, because I genuinely have thought about this 100 times. If you had been in my position, if you had a grandmother who kept telling you she was fine, who seemed legally competent, who had explicitly said she knew what she was doing, what would you have done? Be honest, because I made the wrong call twice before I made the right one, and I do not think that makes me weak. I think it makes me human. Drop it in the comments if you have been in a situation like this. I really want to know. I took a week of vacation in November of 2021. I told my job I needed time for a family situation. I drove to Beaumont on a Sunday night, and I checked into a Hampton Inn on Interstate 10, because I did not want Brenda to know I was in town. That was the first decision I made as a strategist rather than a granddaughter. I made a list on a yellow legal pad. Everything that was documented, everything that was alleged, everything that was a gap, a thing that should have a record but did not, or a thing that had a record that did not match what we had been told. The list had 3 columns. Facts. Questions. Next steps. The facts. Dorothy had established the Calloway Family Living Trust in 2018 through Robert Thibodeau. The original trust named her 4 children, my mother Renee, Gerald, Patricia, and Marcus, as successor trustees in equal shares. The house on Calder Avenue had been transferred into the trust at that time. All of this was filed correctly and was publicly accessible through the county clerk's records. The amendment, filed in April of 2021 with the Jefferson County Clerk, executed by a different attorney, a man named Dale Fontenot, whose office I had now looked up extensively. Dale Fontenot was a solo practitioner who had been licensed in Texas for 11 years. He had 1 Yelp review. He had no disciplinary history with the state bar, but he also had no discernible estate planning practice. His firm's website listed his areas of practice as personal injury, DUI defense, and general civil matters. He was not an estate planning attorney. Now, that alone does not prove wrongdoing. People go to the wrong kind of lawyer for things all the time. What it told me was that this amendment had not gone through my grandmother's existing attorney. It had not gone through the person who knew her history, her intentions, her family structure. It had gone through someone who did not know Dorothy Mae Calloway from any other client who walked through his door. I filed a public records request with the Jefferson County Clerk's office for a full copy of the trust amendment. That took 4 business days. While I waited, I did 2 other things. First, I called Robert Thibodeau's office. His paralegal told me he had retired in early 2021. I asked if another attorney in the firm had taken over Dorothy Calloway's file. The paralegal looked it up and told me that Dorothy had called in February of 2021 to request her original documents be returned to her. She had not transferred her representation to anyone in the firm. She had simply withdrawn her files. February of 2021, 2 months before the Fontenot Amendment was filed. Second, I called my grandmother's primary care physician's office. I did not ask about medical records. I knew I could not access those without authorization. What I asked was whether Dorothy Calloway had had any cognitive assessments done in the past 12 months. The nurse I spoke to could not give me details, but she confirmed that Dorothy's last visit had included a standard mini mental state examination, and that Dorothy had scored within normal range. That was both a relief and a complication. A relief because it meant my grandmother was not cognitively impaired in any clinical sense. A complication because it meant that whatever was happening, it was not happening to a woman who could not understand what she was signing. It was happening to a woman who was fully aware, but who was being influenced, being shaped, being managed by someone who had spent 14 months learning exactly how to present choices to Dorothy in a way that Dorothy would accept. There is a legal term for this: undue influence. It does not require cognitive impairment. It requires dependence, isolation, and a person who systematically exploits both. When the trust amendment arrived from the county clerk, I sat in my Hampton Inn room with a highlighter, and I read it 3 times. Brenda Holt was named co-trustee. That I already knew. What I had not known, what nobody in my family had known, was the second page. There was a will amendment attached. A codicil, executed the same day as the trust amendment, before the same notary, in the same office. And in that codicil, Dorothy Mae Calloway had changed the beneficiary designation on 2 of her 4 savings accounts. The Regions account, the Wells Fargo account. Combined value, approximately $380,000. The new beneficiary on both accounts was Brenda Holt. I put the document down on the bed. I looked at the textured ceiling of that Hampton Inn room. I could hear the ice machine humming in the hallway, the air conditioning unit clicking on and off, a television through the wall, muffled and distant. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that. I did not cry, because by that point I had moved somewhere past grief and into something colder and more focused, the kind of focus that does not leave room for crying, because every cognitive resource you have is already occupied. I picked up my phone and I called my mother. I said, "Mom, we need an elder law attorney, tomorrow morning, first thing." And then I said the thing I had been afraid to say out loud for 6 months. I think someone is stealing from Grandma, and I think they have been doing it for a long time. If this story is making you think of someone you know, a parent, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle who has a caregiver in their life right now, please send this to them, or to the family member who needs to hear it. Because the pattern I am describing is not rare. It has a name. It has warning signs. And most families do not catch it until it is much further along than we were. Her name was Sandra Okafor, elder law attorney, Beaumont, Texas. 12 years of practice, and according to 3 separate people I called before I ever dialed her number, she was the person you wanted in Jefferson County when a family situation had crossed from uncomfortable into legally serious. I sat across from her in her office on the Monday morning after I found the codicil. I had the trust amendment. I had the codicil. I had a printed copy of the appraisal district record. I had my 3-column yellow legal pad. I had a timeline I had typed up at 2 a.m. in my Hampton Inn room, single-spaced, 4 pages long. Sandra read everything without speaking. When she finished, she set the documents down on her desk, folded her hands, and said, "How quickly can you get your family here?" That was the moment I understood this was real. Not in the way I had understood it emotionally. I had understood it emotionally since the night I found the codicil. But legally real, actionable, real. The kind of real that has a process and a timeline and specific steps that need to happen in a specific order before anything can be protected or recovered. Sandra walked me through the landscape. Here is what she explained in that first meeting, and I am going to give it to you straight, because I think this information matters. The trust amendment, as co-trustee designation, was concerning but not immediately reversible, based on documentation alone. What it did was create a shared authority structure that Brenda could theoretically use to initiate financial actions, account access, asset transfers, property decisions, alongside my grandmother. The original trust instrument would govern how much latitude that co-trustee role actually carried, but the fact that the amendment had been drafted by a non-specialist attorney meant there was a reasonable chance it had been written broadly. And a broadly written co-trustee provision in the hands of someone with bad intentions was a serious exposure. The codicil, the beneficiary change on the two savings accounts, was the more urgent problem. Beneficiary designations on financial accounts pass outside of probate and outside of a will. They transfer automatically upon death. If my grandmother passed away with Brenda Holt named on those accounts, there was nothing a probate court could do about it after the fact, without an extremely difficult and expensive legal fight. And even then, success was not guaranteed. Sandra said we had 3 potential avenues. 1. Approach Dorothy directly, with family present and no Brenda in the room, and ask her to voluntarily reverse the changes. 2. File for a temporary guardianship or conservatorship, but that was a nuclear option with significant emotional and legal costs, and it required proving incapacity, which the cognitive assessment made difficult. 3. Document everything we had, establish a pattern of undue influence, and pursue a civil action to have the codicil and the trust amendment voided on those grounds. She said we should probably do all 3, in that order as quickly as possible. And then she said something that I wrote down word for word on my legal pad. She said, "The most important thing you need right now is a conversation with your grandmother that happens without Brenda Holt present. If you cannot get that conversation, everything else becomes harder." Getting that conversation turned out to be the hardest part of the entire process. Because by November of 2021, Brenda Holt was at that house 6 days a week. And on the one day she was not there, my grandmother's mobility made it difficult for Dorothy to go anywhere without assistance. We needed a plan, and we needed it to not look like a plan. My Uncle Marcus is the reason it worked. I want to give him that credit, because he had spent most of this process telling us we were overthinking it. He was the one who kept saying Grandma was sharp, Brenda seemed fine, we needed to trust Dorothy's judgment. He was the family member Brenda had the most access to, partly because he lived the closest, partly because he is the youngest of the siblings and had always had a slightly easier, less formal relationship with Dorothy. When I laid out everything for him, the timeline, the attorney names, the codicil, the account values, he went quiet in a way I had not heard from him before. Not Gerald's careful quiet. Something raw, like a person recalculating every recent memory at once. He said, "Tell me what you need me to do." The plan was simple. On a Thursday morning in early December, Brenda's one day off, Marcus would go to Dorothy's house and take her to breakfast. Just the 2 of them. Their normal thing. They had done it before. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would raise a flag. My mother, Aunt Patricia, and I would be at a diner 3 blocks away. When Marcus texted us that he and Dorothy were settled at their table, we would come in. That is all the plan was. Get my grandmother in a room with her children, without Brenda, over eggs and coffee. See what she said when nobody was managing the conversation for her. I remember the smell of that diner, bacon grease and dish soap, and something sweet, maybe syrup that had dried on a table somewhere nearby. We walked in, and Dorothy looked up from her coffee, and her face did something complicated. Something I still think about. She was surprised. But underneath the surprise, there was something else. Something that looked, just for 1 second before she arranged her expression, like relief. We sat down. Marcus had told her we wanted to have breakfast together. All of us. She had said that was nice. She was composed. Dorothy was always composed. But there was a careful quality to her composure. The way a person holds themselves when they have been managing something alone for a long time, and they are not ready to stop managing it yet. My mother was the one who started. She put her hand over Dorothy's on the table. She said, "Mama, we need to talk to you about some things we have found, and we need you to know that nobody here is angry. We just love you, and we are worried." Dorothy looked at the table. She did not pull her hand away. My mother walked through it. The trust amendment, the codicil, the accounts, the attorney in orange whose name none of us recognized. She kept her voice steady. She did not editorialize. She just laid out what we had found, piece by piece, the way you describe a storm that has already passed, rather than one that is coming." Dorothy listened to all of it without interrupting. When my mother finished, there was a long pause. Long enough that I became aware again of all the sounds in that diner. The scrape of a chair. A short-order cook calling an order back. Someone laughing at a table near the window. Then Dorothy said, "She told me you would try to take control of my money." She said it quietly, not accusingly, more like she was hearing herself say it for the first time from the outside. My mother said, "Who told you that, Mama?" Dorothy looked up. "And this is the moment I will carry with me for the rest of my life, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so small and so devastating at the same time." She said, "Brenda told me that if I let you all get involved, you would put me in a home. That you were waiting for a reason." She paused. She said she was the only one who actually wanted me to stay in my house. There it was. Not a complicated scheme. Not financial jargon, or legal maneuvers, or shell entities. Just a simple, targeted lie told to a lonely 81-year-old woman who loved her house and was afraid of losing it. Told by someone who had spent 14 months earning the specific trust required to make that lie believable. Brenda had not needed a sophisticated fraud. She had only needed access, patience, and one fear. Dorothy agreed to meet with Sandra Okafor. She agreed to have her existing documents reviewed. She agreed to let us contact the two banks about the beneficiary designations. She cried once briefly, into a paper napkin. Then she straightened up and ordered more coffee, and said, "I want this fixed." That was Dorothy. She met with Sandra 4 days later. Without Brenda, Dorothy confirmed to Sandra, on the record, that she had felt pressured, that she had not fully understood the co-trustee designation when she signed it, that she had believed she was adding Brenda as a safeguard, not as a legal authority. She said the attorney, Fontenot, had explained things quickly, and she had not felt comfortable asking him to slow down. Sandra filed a petition to void the trust amendment and the codicil on grounds of undue influence. She also filed a complaint with the Jefferson County District Attorney's Elder Financial Exploitation Unit. We sent Brenda a certified letter terminating her employment. We did it through Sandra's office, not through any family member, because we had been advised not to have direct contact. Brenda did not respond to the letter. But she did call Dorothy 17 times in the 48 hours after it was sent. Dorothy did not answer. What happened next was not a courtroom confrontation. It was not a dramatic deposition or a moment where Brenda broke down on a witness stand. What happened was slower and uglier and more bureaucratic than anything you would put in a movie. But it worked. Dale Fontenot, when contacted by Sandra's office, initially cooperated. He said Dorothy had come to him voluntarily, that she had seemed lucid and clear about what she wanted, that Brenda had been present at the meeting. He confirmed that without being asked, which Sandra told me later was a significant admission. Because an attorney who allows a potential undue influencer to sit in on a client's estate planning meeting has a problem regardless of what the client appeared to want. He provided his file. His notes were thin. There was no record of him conducting any independent assessment of Dorothy's understanding of the documents. There was no record of him asking Brenda to step out of the room at any point. There was a single line in his intake notes that read, "Client accompanied by caregiver, Brenda H." That one line cost him. The Texas State Bar received a complaint. Fontenot's license was not immediately suspended. These things take time. But an investigation was opened. Last I checked, it was still pending resolution. The civil petition to void the trust amendment and the codicil moved through the Jefferson County District Court over the following 6 months. Brenda retained an attorney, a real one this time, from Houston, who argued that Dorothy had signed voluntarily and competently. That argument was not without merit, on paper. But Dorothy's own testimony, Sandra's documentation of the pattern of isolation and manipulation, and the structural irregularities in how the documents had been prepared all worked against Brenda's position. The judge voided the codicil entirely in May of 2022. The trust amendment was voided the following month. The beneficiary designations on the Regions and Wells Fargo accounts were restored to Dorothy's original instructions, split equally among her 4 children. The co-trustee designation was removed. Brenda Holt had no further legal authority over anything connected to Dorothy Mae Calloway's estate. The district attorney's office declined to pursue criminal charges. They cited insufficient evidence of deliberate criminal intent. Essentially, they could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Brenda had set out from the beginning with a fraudulent plan, as opposed to someone who had gradually overstepped in ways that were improper, but not provably criminal under the specific statutes available. I will be honest with you. That part was hard to accept. Sandra told me it was a common outcome. That elder financial exploitation is genuinely difficult to prosecute criminally because of the same qualities that make it so insidious: the exploitation of trust, the gradual erosion of boundaries, the difficulty of proving intent rather than just impact. She said the civil victory was the more reliable path. She said to be grateful for what we had gotten. I am grateful. I am. But grateful and satisfied are not the same thing. My grandmother died in March of 2023, 16 months after that breakfast at the diner. She died in her house on Calder Avenue, in the bedroom she had slept in for 49 years, with my mother sitting beside her. She did not die robbed. The house passed to the trust, as she had intended. The accounts distributed to her 4 children, as she had intended. The mineral rights are still in the family, managed now by Gerald, who has turned out to have a talent for it that none of us anticipated. The estate, the whole of it, $1.7 million built over a lifetime of cold winters and careful savings, and one lucky knock on the door from an oil company landman, went exactly where Dorothy wanted it to go. And yet, I think about that breakfast at the diner, about the look on my grandmother's face when we walked in, that flicker of something that looked like relief before she composed herself. And I wonder how long she had been sitting with what Brenda told her, how long she had been quietly afraid that her children wanted to take her house. How many nights she had lain in that bedroom on Calder Avenue, believing, because someone she trusted had told her so, that the people who loved her were her threat. I wonder if she was lonely in a way she did not know how to tell us. Not because we were absent. We were not absent. Not really, but because there is a specific loneliness that comes from needing help and not wanting to be a burden, and Brenda had found that loneliness and walked straight into it. Brenda understood something about my grandmother that we, who loved Dorothy more than anyone, had not fully reckoned with. She understood that Dorothy's greatest fear was not death. It was dependency. It was losing her house. It was the loss of the life she had built, inch by inch, from a 2-room house in Vidor, Texas. Brenda used that fear like a tool, and I do not know what to do with the fact that Brenda was also, in some ways, the person who was most present for my grandmother during some of the hardest years of her life. She was there through the pandemic isolation. She was there for the fall and the recovery and the slow decline in mobility. She sat with Dorothy when we could not. She knew how Dorothy took her coffee and what television programs she liked and which of her medications made her nauseous. That care was real. I am almost certain of it, at least in the beginning. People who do what Brenda ultimately did are not usually entirely cynical from day one. More often, something shifts. Entitlement grows inside genuine affection. A person begins to believe they deserve more than they are being given. That their labor, their presence, their sacrifice earns them a claim that the law does not recognize. I do not forgive Brenda. I want to be clear about that. What she did caused real harm to my grandmother's peace of mind, to our family's trust in each other, to months and months of our lives. The legal process cost money and emotional labor that none of us have fully recovered. And my grandmother spent the last 2 years of her life knowing that someone she had welcomed into her home had tried to reroute her legacy. But I also do not think the story of what happened is as simple as evil versus good. I think it is the story of what happens when an elderly person's needs outpace a family's attention. When the gap between what someone needs and what their family is able to provide becomes large enough for someone else to fill, and that someone else decides, at some point, that filling the gap entitles them to the inheritance. If you have an elderly person in your life, a parent, a grandparent, anyone, and there is a caregiver in that picture, please hear me on this. I am not saying every caregiver is Brenda. Most are not. Most are people doing hard, underpaid, underappreciated work with genuine care. But I am saying, stay present. Call more than you think you need to. Notice when the language changes. Notice who is speaking for whom. Notice whether your loved one's fears are beginning to sound like someone else's words. If this story helped you see something you needed to see, or if it reminded you to make a phone call you have been putting off, I really hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not for me. For them. For the Dorothy in your life who deserves to have someone paying attention. My grandmother's house is still standing on Calder Avenue. My mother has talked about keeping it in the family. About maybe one day making it a place where the grandchildren can gather the way we used to when Dorothy was alive, and would make biscuits from scratch on Sunday mornings, and refuse all offers of help. I do not know what will happen to it. Property decisions are complicated, and families are complicated, and the future is not something any of us can file in a county clerk's office and expect to hold. But the trust held. Dorothy's trust held. And sometimes, in the middle of everything that goes wrong, that is enough to build on. My name is Nicole. Thank you for listening to all of it.